Could you tell us a bit more about the secret gospel of Mark and why you don't think it's authentic, both in the sense that it doesn't tell us about the historical Jesus and also in the sense that you're not sure it's ancient?
John
Yeah,
insisted that we talk about that one.
yeah, and I'm glad to. I'm glad to. In fact, let me, for the first time, publicly air on your podcast a theory
You're
that I think has been voiced. It's not in print. I've been thinking about it on again, off again for 20 years. But the two views are basically this: that Morton Smith is telling the truth. He found it in 1958, written in the back of a book, in 2.5 pages of 18th century Greek. He estimates a monastic hand that reflects the way monks wrote in Mount Athos, Western Greece. And yet, curiously, this volume is found at Marsaba, which is halfway between Jerusalem in the west and the Dead Sea to the east. I've been to Marsaba. I've given lectures right at Marsaba before talking about this text. And so here's this old book by Isaac Voss. It's a critical edition. The book is written in Latin, but it's a critical edition of the letters of Ignatius. And then in the blank end papers in the back, here's this handwritten thing from a later time. So Smith hypothesized that there was a fire, manuscripts were damaged, and a damaged manuscript that's lost the back part of it is written out. It's a letter, supposedly, of the church father Clement of Alexandria to an otherwise unknown fellow named Theodore, talking about, answering his question about, is there really a mystical Mark, mystikos gospel? And Clement is saying, yes, there is. I know it. I've read it. I've seen it. And here are a couple of passages in it. And the offensive one is the one where the young man is nude. The only thing on his naked body, and it really emphasized that he's not wearing any clothes. He's wrapped with a sheet, comes to Jesus at night, and Jesus teaches him the secrets of the kingdom of God and actually quotes Mark 4:11. And so Smith, who was gay, speculates that this is some kind of a homosexual union between, Jesus and his disciple. And of course, he suggests that because of the way Clement in his letter reacts. There are blasphemous people who say awful, wicked, horrible things. So there is an innuendo that's clearly homoerotic. It's in the letter. There's no doubt about it. There are people who deny that, but I think that's naive. It clearly is there. And that's why, Clement is reacting. So there are people who accept his story and therefore accept, basically two views. Clement doesn't know what he's talking about. It's an apocryphal text at best, or it's late. Or, as Scott Brown has argued in his dissertation, and has fiercely defended ever since 1999 when his dissertation came out, he has argued that the letter not only is authentic, but Clement does know what he's talking about. There actually is a longer version of Mark. It goes back to the first century. And at the Mark that we have in our New Testament today is a shorter version where these texts have been removed. And so longer Mark is the authentic Mark, goes back to the first century. And of course, Morton Smith would love that, because, so you mean Jesus in the nude really did instruct, just young male disciples. Smith died in 1991, by the way, and so Scott Brown did know him, and Scott Brown is writing years and years later at University of Toronto. Anyway, the other view is the whole thing is a fake, that Morton Smith either composed it or someone else composed it. And of course, Smith very angrily threatened to sue people who had put that kind of statement in print. And so there's this long history, and it's been debated and debated and debated and debated. Stephen Carlson came out with a book in 2005, same year, coincidentally, that Scott Brown's edited dissertation came out in print. Stephen Carlson, who now is in Australia, professor of New Testament, he has argued it most certainly is a fake. He's had handwriting people examine it. He himself, an attorney and a copyright specialist, has knowledge of handwriting analysis. And he shows Morton Smith as the author. He actually bought this book with blank end papers, and he wrote the 2.5 pages of Greek, studied the handwriting, how to imitate it. And I got to admit, the evidence there is suggestive I don't know how well you know Greek, but you got the letter theta. Most of us write what looks like an O, and then we separate stroke as horizontal. Smith had a way of doing it with one stroke. He did that with the T, the tau. Instead of doing that and then that, as we usually do, he did this. He did the same thing with the L, the lambda, instead of two strokes, as most people do. And occasionally in the handwriting of this 2.5-page Greek text, this letter that quotes supposedly the long-lost long version of Mark, you get that written the same way. You actually get letters occasionally written that way. And so Carlson argued this is where he slips up. And he's trying to imitate a certain hand, does so very well most of the time, but occasionally slips up with these three letters. Okay. I'm no handwriting expert, so I just go with what they say. The late Herschel Shanks, founder of Biblical Archaeology Review, editor of it, he hired two Greek-speaking handwriting experts, and they disagreed. One of them said, yeah, Smith wrote it, and the other one, a younger, less experienced woman, said, no, I don't think he could. So there you are. The handwriting experts disagree. I'm no handwriting expert. I don't know. So did Smith fake it? Maybe, maybe not. I really don't know. But I'll tell you, there's some strongly suggestive stuff that something funny's going on. And here's why, and this is why I don't follow it. There are 3 publications by Smith prior to 1958 when he supposedly founded at Mar Saba. And in these 3 publications, he articulates very weird ideas that are in secret Mark before he found it. And one of them was the quotation of Mark 4:11 about the mysteries of the kingdom are for you. And Smith provocatively suggests in his English version of his Hebrew university dissertation, he provocatively suggests that the secrets of the kingdom of God have to do with prohibited sexual activities. What the heck? Nobody ever thought that. The secrets of the kingdom are secret rites that involve prohibited sexual activity. Look in the history of the interpretation of that verse. No one has ever suggested that. Smith does, and Shazam, a few years later, finds a text where that is suggested. Whoa! That guy, he should buy lottery tickets. Now, there are 2 other things that one other one I'll mention, and that is he also suggests that in the original longer version of Mark, there was Johannine-like stuff, like the resurrection of the dead Lazarus, John 11. Well, Shazam! That's in secret Mark. This passage, the young man who comes to Jesus nude, is Lazarus who was raised from the dead. Well, boy, can you believe that from a scholarly point of view, speculating like that? And then finding a text that supports it a few years later? Oh my goodness. Now, guys, this is for you, brand new, your podcast, first to hear it. It's possible that Smith did not compose this text, that he did find it, not at Mar Saba in 1958, but in a used bookshop in Jerusalem in 1940, or New York in 38, 39. Smith, you will recall, was trapped in Israel for 4 years because of World War II. He's there, the war starts, it's too dangerous to come home through the Mediterranean, so he stays in Israel and he improves his knowledge of Hebrew, which really served him well. He got to know Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar of mysticism and Gnosticism and so on. And I suspect that he already had the text, was struggling to read it. He borrowed books on monastic handwriting from Mount Athos, not because he wanted to imitate the text, but because he wanted to decipher the text. And I've tried to decipher monastic Greek. It is difficult. And so it's possible he is studying the text in the early 40s, marooned there, getting interested in an esoteric Jesus. He is gay. He is interested in magic, and it all comes together. What if Jesus was a magician, or there's a text talking about him as a magician, who happens also to be gay? And so for Smith, it's, do I run with this thing? It's the darndest text. I can hardly read it. I can hardly understand it. Written in the back of this book. Small, cramped writing style. And he's not sure what to do, but by the time we get to 1958, of course, the war is over. He's back in the United States. He has a teaching job. He's angry at Brown, which he felt religious men wouldn't hire him because he was too liberal. So he's angry at a conservative, straight Christianity, and he's going to get him. He's decided by 1958, you know what? I think this text is worth studying. He's transcribed it. He's photographed it. So he goes to Marsaba in 58 and he finds it and leaves it there, as he should. Otherwise, he's stealing it. He comes home, and in 1960 in New York, he announces the discovery that he made just 2 years ago. The problem is he's been talking about it by this point for over 10 years. That's what gives him away, unless you want to believe in extraordinary coincidences. Now, this is a new theory. Am I right? I don't know, maybe. This way, you don't have to argue that Smith wrote it out himself. You don't have to argue that he's guilty of some outrageous fabrication. The only thing he's guilty of, he hasn't told the truth about when and where he found the book. That's all. And it was only after he was convinced that scholars like Henry Chadwick, and some other great Harvard divines, they didn't point it out that it's obviously a hoax, obviously a fake. Morton, did you write this? Once he's convinced that nobody thinks it's obvious fake, people are suspicious, he then devotes the next 13 years and publishes it in 1973 in popular form and a 450-page technical form by Harvard University Press. And even he isn't sure if it's genuine, because in his 1970, 8 or 9, Jesus the Magician, he never appeals to the text to support his hypothesis that Jesus was a magician and perhaps gay. He doesn't even appeal to this text. Scholarly vanity would say, of course he would appeal to it. My gosh, he found the text that gives him evidence. But he doesn't. And I would argue it isn't because he knows it's fake. He wrote it himself. No. He just himself is never quite convinced that it's a credible text. So in the end, he doesn't rely on it in making his case. There you are, guys. You're the first to air this. You're going to get some interesting feedback.
I look forward to
thank
that.
you saw it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for that very thoughtful, and I mean that was fascinating. How's the field gonna react to these types of things? I mean, this is obviously very controversial because it's not just biblical scholarship, it's contemporary sexuality debates and all of that stuff. I mean, what is the field around this book, and how have you been received in that, and how do you even think the comments you just made are going to be seen? Does it get lumped into there's the homophobic scholars and the not, or you know what I mean? Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's going to be mixed. There'll be people like Scott Brown who will probably say, well, I'm glad Professor Evans has recognized that it's not likely that Smith is the forger. He would take that as a win. But Scott is still invested in the idea that it's an ancient text, not just ancient, it's the original form of Mark. So it's very important text critical witness, at least in two different places in Mark chapter 10 and somewhere else. And so he will continue to argue for his theory, assuming he's still in scholarship. I'm not sure. He unfortunately never found a teaching position, so I don't know if he's still active. Tony Burke, who hosted the conference on forgeries at York University in Toronto in 2011, I was there, and my longtime good friend Marvin Meyer was there. Unfortunately, he died a year later. And he was always a supporter of the authenticity of secret mark. So we were very divided. Peter Jeffrey was there, Bruce Chilton was there, Stephen Carlson via Zoom. He was in Australia. And so it was a very divided group. And this book came out a couple years later, published. It's on my shelf right over there. And they're arguing that it's authentic. And I thought, my reply is, well, this book is on forgeries. And we have chapters on secret mark. Isn't that curious? So how convinced are you as editors of this volume that, I mean, if this is a conference on forgeries in antiquity, here we are talking about secret mark. I think it is a forgery. The only real question is who's the forger? And a forger could be somebody from the 19th century. And Morton Smith finds the book, 30, 40 years later, and then is curious about it. And I think to the end of his life wasn't really sure. The only thing he ever vehemently pushed back against was accusations that he was the forger. That would make him angry. And if he wasn't the forger, I can see why he was angry. But he never went out on a limb arguing that it was authentic. And to me, that's the smoking gun. His own book on the subject, Jesus as a magician and possibly gay. And he makes no use of secret mark. In fact, the late Robert Hamerton Kelly, in his review of Mark the Magician, criticizes Mark the Magician for, what a crazy theory resting on something so uncertain and dubious as secret mark. And Smith fired back and said, the allegation that I made use of secret mark for my theory is absolutely false. That is really interesting. So Smith clearly, knowingly, deliberately made no use of secret mark in building his thesis that Jesus was a gay magician. And I think that's very telling. And so that tells me that Smith, he didn't really know, is secret mark authentic or not? And so what Scott Brown says is, okay, Smith didn't understand it correctly. And so Scott wants to understand it better and is that way able to go back and argue that it's early and authentic. Now, Peter Jeffrey comes back and says the only way you can do that is to destroy the text. And that's similar to my argument about the Gospel of Thomas. The only way you can make secret mark first century or second century is to strip away all the lateness of it. And so you misinterpret it. You have to destroy the real meaning of the text. You have to destroy the text to save it for your use. That's similar to the argument I was making about Thomas. The only way you can make Thomas early is to mutilate it, to destroy the text. So my sense is, in fact, where we ended, Bruce Chilton made this argument. I made this argument in our closing remarks at this conference, is, folks, my recommendation is don't make use of this text for talking about the historic, authentic Clement of Alexandria, because in this letter he actually argues that you take an oath and lie. Well, the church father Clement of Alexandria, that flies in the face of everything he teaches. Take an oath and lie? Jesus says, don't take oaths and let your yes be yes. And here's a church father who knows the Dominical tradition inside and out, and he says, take an oath and lie? And say, oh, no, it doesn't exist, when in fact we all know it does. And the other thing is, this text, are you really going to deal with Mark and textual criticism on the basis of such a dubious text? And thirdly, are you really going to talk about the historical Jesus, perhaps as gay and as a magician, on the basis of this text? So our conclusion was, leave it alone. You don't need to accuse Morton Smith of anything. Just leave it alone. It's recommended if you're going to be a scholar and critical, don't do anything with it. That's where it's been left. And my sense is in scholarship in the 14 years since then, that's where we are. Yeah, there's a couple of people out there. One of them is in Norway who keeps beating the drum. Marx, Smith didn't lie. It's genuine, blah, blah, blah. But mainstream scholarship is saying, forget it. If you're going to talk about Mark and the historical Jesus or the real church father, Clement of Alexandria, don't bother with this text.
I got to follow up on that. There just seems to be in scholarship a real strong desire to have other versions of Christianity in the first century, that the Orthodox, this idea of there's one Orthodox church and these weird deviations, that's sort of an antiquated idea. There were many different Christianities floating around fighting for dominance. What do you make of that claim?
That was just the first 20 minutes of an hour-plus long interview with Craig Evans where he talks about this and so much more. So go ahead and subscribe so that you will be notified when that drops in the next few weeks.